My name is Serena Adeyemi. I am 36 years old, and the first time my family tried to take what my grandfather left me, they did it with smiles so practiced I almost believed they were genuine. It was a Tuesday morning in March, the kind of morning where the sky is gray and flat, and the air smells like rain that hasn't decided to fall yet. I drove 40 minutes from my apartment in Decatur to a law office in downtown Atlanta, a firm called Hargrove and Associates, 8th floor, glass doors, the kind of carpet that absorbs sound so completely that you feel the silence before you see the room. I had been to that office once before, years earlier, when my grandfather had asked me to come with him to sign some paperwork he didn't want to read alone. I remembered the smell, dark wood and old paper, and something faintly like coffee that had been sitting too long. I sat in a chair near the window. My uncle Bernard was already there when I arrived, along with his wife Patricia, who had coordinated her outfit so carefully for a will reading that I noticed it immediately and said nothing. My Aunt Cynthia sat beside them, her two adult sons arranged behind her like they were posing for a photograph. My mother's brother, the one everyone called a success, was on his phone in the corner with his back slightly turned, which was how he communicated that he considered a room beneath him. I was the only one there without a spouse, without children, without the visible markers of a life my family considered complete. I noticed the seating before I sat down. They had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the central table, the kind of arrangement that leaves one chair slightly outside the arc, the chair by the window, my chair. I sat in it anyway and folded my hands in my lap and looked at the document folder in front of me without opening it. My grandfather, Emmanuel Adeyemi, had died 11 weeks earlier at the age of 81. He had built his wealth quietly, over 50 years, through commercial real estate holdings across Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. He was not a man who spoke about money at family dinners or announced his assets at gatherings. He drove the same silver sedan for 12 years. He wore the same style of watch for as long as I could remember, a simple one with a brown leather strap that he had bought himself when he turned 40. He was the kind of man whose weight in a room you only fully understood after he left it. I had known him better than most of the people in that law office, not because I was special in any announced way, but because I had shown up. For 11 years, I had driven to his house in Macon on the first Sunday of every month. We ate lunch together. He asked me real questions and waited for real answers. He told me things about his early life in Nigeria, about the years he spent building something from nothing in a country that didn't always make space for him, about the decisions he had made that he was proud of, and the ones he had gotten wrong. Nobody else in that room had done that with any regularity. I knew because he had told me, carefully and without bitterness, that most of the family came when they needed something. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I did not sit in that law office expecting to inherit his estate. I was not there calculating. I was there because he was my grandfather, and because the letter from Hargrove and Associates had listed my name among the required attendees, and because I had loved him, and losing him still felt like something I hadn't fully processed yet. The attorney's name was Mr. Hargrove himself, a man in his late 60s with reading glasses on a chain, and a manner so unhurried it felt almost deliberate, like he had learned over decades that the slower you moved in a room, the more carefully people listened. He opened the session at 9:45 in the morning. He thanked everyone for coming. He said the standard things that attorneys say before a will reading, about the process, about the document's legal standing, about the importance of allowing him to read without interruption. My Uncle Bernard's wife, Patricia, leaned toward me before Mr. Hargrove began. She smelled like a department store, and her smile arrived a half second before her eyes did. She whispered, "It's good that you came, Serena. I know Emmanuel thought the world of you. Whatever he's left you, don't feel overwhelmed. Bernard and I are here to help you manage anything complicated." I looked at her. I said thank you. I turned back toward Mr. Hargrove. That was the moment, right there. The word manage sitting in the air between us like something that had already been decided before I walked into the room. If you have ever been in a space where people have already written the ending of your story without asking you a single question, you know exactly what that moment feels like. If you have ever been the person in the family that everyone assumed would need handling, stay with me, because what Mr. Hargrove read next rearranged everything in that room, and not one person sitting in that carefully arranged semicircle had seen it coming. I want to go back before that Tuesday morning, because the law office was not where the story started. It was just where it became impossible to ignore. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, the second child and only daughter of my mother, Vivienne, and my father, Kofi, who separated when I was 9 and divorced quietly 2 years after that. My mother's family, the Adeyemis, were the dominant presence in my childhood. Her brothers, Bernard and Victor, were both considered the successful ones. Bernard had built a property management company that rode the coattails of my grandfather's reputation and connections without anyone in the family saying so directly. Victor was a corporate attorney in Atlanta who wore his title the way some people wear expensive cologne, present in every room before he was. My mother worked as an administrative coordinator at a hospital network for 22 years. She was capable and reliable and consistently passed over for the kind of recognition that went to people with louder voices. She never complained about it, which I think the family mistook for contentment. I was not the favored grandchild. That position belonged to Bernard's oldest son, my cousin Darius, who was 3 years older than me, attended Morehouse on a partial scholarship that my grandfather quietly supplemented, and had the particular gift of making older men feel respected simply by asking them questions in the right tone of voice. Darius was charming. He was also, as I came to understand more clearly as I got older, strategic in ways he never acknowledged openly. My grandfather Emmanuel did not have favorites the way the family assumed he did. What he had was patience. He paid attention over long periods of time and drew conclusions slowly. The family saw his generosity toward Darius, toward Bernard's business, toward Victor's early career, and assumed they understood the hierarchy. What they did not see was that my grandfather was also watching. He watched Darius accept help without acknowledging it. He watched Bernard use the family name to open doors, and then act as if the doors had opened on their own. He watched Victor give advice at family gatherings that always seemed to angle toward his own interests while sounding like concern for others. He watched my mother absorb dismissal after dismissal at those same gatherings and continue showing up anyway, continuing to care for him as he aged, continuing to drive him to medical appointments when his eyes made night driving difficult, continuing to call on Thursday evenings just to check in. And he watched me. I became a forensic accountant. I want to say that plainly without decoration, because the work is specific and the specificity matters. I examined financial records for irregularities, for misrepresentation, for the kind of quiet fraud that happens inside organizations when people believe nobody is looking carefully enough. I had worked for a regional audit firm for 4 years before moving to a federal contract position that I am not at liberty to describe in detail, but which involved financial oversight at a level that would have surprised my family considerably if they had ever asked what I actually did. They did not ask, not once in 7 years. What they knew was that I worked in accounting, which to my Uncle Bernard meant I was good with spreadsheets, and to my Aunt Cynthia meant I had chosen a safe but unglamorous path, and to Darius meant I was the cousin who could probably help him with his taxes if he ever got around to asking. My mother knew more than the others, but still understood only the outline, not the substance. She was proud of me in the general way that parents are proud when their children have stable employment, but the nature of my work was not something she could easily describe at family gatherings, so she usually didn't try. My grandfather asked. That was the difference. The first time he asked me what forensic accounting actually involved, I was 28 years old, and we were sitting at his kitchen table in Macon on one of my monthly Sundays. He had made tea, he poured a cup for me before himself, which was a habit of his I had noticed since childhood. I explained what the work meant, not simplified, not softened. I told him about the methodology, about what patterns in financial records actually indicated when you knew how to read them, about the way certain kinds of fraud repeated themselves across organizations because human behavior under pressure tends toward the same few mistakes. He listened without interrupting for almost 20 minutes. Then he asked 3 questions that told me he had understood everything I said. He asked them in sequence, each one building on the last, the way a person asks questions when they are genuinely thinking and not just waiting for their turn to speak. After the 3rd question, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are very good at seeing things that are hidden." I told him I tried to be. He nodded and looked at his tea and said, "That is a rare thing, Serena. Most people are good at seeing what is in front of them. Seeing what has been deliberately concealed is a different skill entirely." I did not know at the time that he was describing himself as much as he was describing me. Over the years that followed, our monthly Sundays became something I protected. I arranged my work schedule around them. I turned down social plans that conflicted with them. When a work assignment took me to Washington for 6 weeks, I drove back to Macon on the first Sunday of the month anyway, arrived at his door at noon, ate the rice and stew he had made, and drove back that same evening. He never asked me to do that. He simply opened the door when I knocked and said, "I thought you might find a way." The rest of the family came to holiday gatherings. They came when there was something to celebrate or something to ask for. Bernard came when he needed Emmanuel's name attached to a business proposal. Victor came when he wanted advice that would benefit his practice. Darius came when he needed money for something he framed as an investment. My Aunt Cynthia came when she wanted to feel the comfort of a family structure that still had Emmanuel at its center. I came on the first Sunday of every month because I wanted to. That distinction did not register with the family until it was too late for it to matter to them. What I also did not know during those years was that my grandfather had been making decisions, careful ones. He had revised his will twice in the decade before his death, each revision made with Mr. Hargrove, each one more deliberate than the last. He had also, as I would later learn, kept a private journal in which he documented his observations of the family, his concerns, his reasoning, and his intentions. Not dramatically, not as a performance for posterity, simply as a man who had spent his life noticing things and had decided to write them down. He had also, at some point I cannot pin to a specific year, made a decision about me. Not because I had earned it in any transactional sense, not because I had shown up on Sundays calculating what might come from it. He made the decision because he had watched me for 36 years and understood something about my character that the rest of the family had never bothered to look for. He understood that I was the one person in his life who had never needed anything from him except his company, and he had decided that was worth everything. The will reading itself lasted 41 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock on the wall when Mr. Hargrove began, and again when he finished, and the number stayed with me the way specific details stay with you when everything around them is moving too fast to process cleanly. Mr. Hargrove read the preliminary sections first. The language was formal and slow, and the room held a particular quality of restrained anticipation that I recognized from certain professional situations, the kind of stillness that exists just before information lands that will change the arrangement of things. Bernard sat with his hands folded on the table. Patricia had stopped smiling and replaced it with an expression of careful neutrality. Victor had put his phone away. Darius leaned slightly forward with his elbows on his knees, the posture of a man who has already rehearsed his reaction to good news. My grandfather's estate was significant. I had known in a general sense that Emmanuel Adeyemi had built something substantial over 50 years, but the specific number, when Mr. Hargrove read it into the record, landed differently than a general sense. The total value of the estate, including commercial properties, financial holdings, and private assets, was assessed at approximately $78 million. The room did not react visibly, but I felt the shift in it. The way everyone's breathing changed almost imperceptibly, the way a held breath is different from a normal one. Then Mr. Hargrove turned to the distribution. He read the secondary bequests first, a specific property in Macon left to my mother, Vivian, along with a sum that would allow her to retire from the hospital job she had worked for 22 years without financial anxiety. A modest cash bequest to each of Bernard's children, including Darius. A contribution directed to a church in Macon that Emmanuel had attended for 40 years. Several smaller amounts to individuals and organizations I did not recognize by name, but which clearly represented long relationships my grandfather had maintained quietly. Bernard received nothing beyond what his children received individually. Victor received nothing. Patricia received nothing. Cynthia received nothing. I watched each of them process this in real time. Bernard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Victor's hand moved to his phone out of habit and then stopped. Patricia's carefully neutral expression developed a slight tension around the eyes. Darius sat back slowly, recalibrating. Then Mr. Hargrove read the final and primary disposition of the estate. The remainder of the estate, constituting the majority of all holdings, properties, financial accounts, and assets not previously specified, is left in its entirety to my granddaughter, Serena Adeyemi, to be held in her sole name, under her sole authority, with no requirement of oversight, no trustee condition, and no family consultation clause. He continued reading. My grandfather had included an explanatory paragraph which Mr. Hargrove read without editorial. Emmanuel had written that his decision was not made in haste or in the influence of any single relationship, but after years of deliberate observation. He had written that he trusted Serena's judgment not because she was without flaw, but because she was the only member of his family who had never attempted to shape his perception of others for personal benefit. He had written that he hoped the family would receive this with grace, and that if they did not, the legal protections he had arranged would speak for themselves. The room was very quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then Bernard spoke. His voice was controlled, but the control was effortful in a way that was visible if you were watching for it. He said, "There must be some mistake." Mr. Hargrove said, "There was no mistake." Bernard said, "The document should be reviewed by an independent attorney." Mr. Hargrove said he was welcome to arrange that, and that the document would withstand any review. Patricia put her hand on Bernard's arm. Victor said nothing, but his expression had closed completely, the professional mask dropping into place. Darius looked at me for the first time since I had sat down, and his expression was something I did not have an immediate word for. Not quite anger, not quite surprise, something more like the face a person makes when they realize a game they thought they were winning was never the game being played. I did not speak. I sat with my hands folded and looked at Mr. Hargrove and waited. After the room had settled into an uncomfortable quiet, Patricia leaned toward me again. The warmth from earlier had a different quality now, thinner, more pressured at the edges. She said, "Serena, obviously this is a shock for everyone. We are not suggesting anything improper. We simply think, given the scale of this, that a family conversation would be appropriate before any decisions are made. You understand how complex managing this kind of estate can be. Bernard has experience with commercial property. Victor understands the legal structure. We only want to make sure you're protected." I looked at her. I said, "I appreciate that. Then I turned back to Mr. Hargrove and asked what the next steps were from a legal and administrative standpoint. Bernard's face changed when I did that. The offer had been declined before they finished making it, and he understood that immediately. I drove home that afternoon and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Not in shock, not in grief, though the grief was still present underneath everything, like a low sound you become aware of only when the room is quiet. I sat there processing what had happened with the same part of my mind I use when a financial record reveals something that requires careful handling. The estate was mine. That was legally clear. What was also clear was that my family was not going to accept that without resistance, and that the resistance would not be loud or immediate. It would be patient and organized and dressed in the language of concern, which was the only language that family had ever used when they wanted something they weren't supposed to want. I was right about that within 72 hours. Bernard called the morning after the reading. His tone was measured and reasonable in the way that people are measured and reasonable when they have prepared what they are going to say. He suggested we meet for lunch to discuss the estate management going forward. He said he had contacts in commercial real estate across the Southeast who could help transition management of the properties. He said he only wanted to make sure things were handled properly during what he acknowledged was a difficult time. I told him I would think about it. I did not meet him for lunch. Victor called the following day. His approach was different, more formal, more structured around the language of legal complexity. He said that an estate of this scale typically required experienced legal counsel to administer effectively. He said he had handled estate transitions before and would be willing to offer his services to the family at a reduced rate as a gesture of solidarity. He used the word solidarity twice, which told me the word had been chosen carefully. I thanked him and told him I had already retained independent counsel. I had not yet, but I did so within 4 hours of ending that call. I contacted an estate attorney named Patricia Owusu, whom I knew professionally through a former colleague, a woman with a reputation for precision and no tolerance for ambiguity. I explained the situation. She reviewed the will documents I sent her that evening and called me back the following morning with a clear assessment. The document was airtight. Emmanuel had done this properly and deliberately. There was no credible legal challenge to the disposition. She also flagged something I had not noticed in my own reading of the document. There was a protective clause on the final page, a clause that specified that any legal challenge to the will filed by a named family member would result in the automatic forfeiture of any bequest that family member had received. It was a serious clause, the kind that required real legal forethought to construct. My grandfather had apparently anticipated exactly this situation. I read it twice. Then I called Patricia Usui back and asked her to confirm my understanding. She confirmed it. Then she said, "Your grandfather worked with Mr. Hargrove for a very long time. This document was built to last." I sat with that for a moment. Then I printed the relevant pages of the will and placed them in a folder in the top drawer of my desk. That folder became important later. What happened next arrived not as a direct confrontation, but as something quieter and in some ways harder to address. Darius began calling my mother. Not me, my mother. He called her 3 times in the week following the reading, each call framed as a check-in, as a concern for how she was processing her father's death, as a family reaching out in grief. My mother told me about the calls without suspecting anything initially. She said Darius seemed genuinely affected by Emmanuel's passing. She said he had asked how I was doing, whether I had spoken to Bernard, whether I was feeling overwhelmed. I listened to my mother describe those calls, and I understood exactly what they were. They were reconnaissance. Darius was mapping the situation through the softest entry point available to him, which was my mother's genuine grief and her genuine belief that the family was capable of behaving decently when it mattered. That was the moment I stopped waiting. I called Patricia Owusu the next morning and asked her to begin the formal transfer process immediately. I wanted every account, every property title, every administrative detail moved into proper order before anyone had the opportunity to create confusion around it. She said she could begin that week. I told her to begin that day. I also started keeping records of every contact from the family, every call, every text, every message passed through my mother, dates, times, content, tone. Not because I was building a case yet, because I had spent my career understanding that the time to document is before you need the documentation, not after. I did not tell anyone in the family what I was doing. I did not respond to Bernard's second voicemail. I did not respond to Victor's follow-up email. I let the silence work the way silence works when the other side is expecting resistance and gets stillness instead. It makes people move. And when people move without thinking clearly, they leave evidence. I was waiting for them to move. They did not disappoint me. The move came on a Thursday evening, 5 weeks after the will reading. Patricia Owusu called me at 6:47 in the evening. I remember the time because I had just made dinner and the food was still on the stove when my phone rang. She did not open with pleasantries, which told me immediately that what she was about to say required full attention. She said that Hargrove and Associates had received a formal legal petition that afternoon. Bernard, Victor, and Darius had jointly filed a challenge to the will on 2 grounds. The first was undue influence, the claim that I had manipulated Emmanuel in his final years to alter his estate planning in my favor. The second was diminished capacity, the claim that Emmanuel had not been of sound mind when the final version of the will was executed. I sat down at my kitchen table. The food on the stove went cold. I asked Patricia what the timeline looked like. She said a hearing had been requested for 6 weeks out. She said the petition was legally formatted and clearly prepared by someone who understood estate litigation, which meant Victor had either drafted it himself or directed its preparation. She said the language around undue influence was specific enough that someone had provided detailed information about the nature and frequency of my visits to Emmanuel, including the monthly Sunday lunches. That detail stopped me. The only people who knew the regularity of those visits were Emmanuel himself, my mother, and the family members who had noticed my absence at gatherings I had missed in order to be in Macon on the first Sunday of a given month. I asked Patricia what she needed from me. She gave me a list. Financial records showing I had never received money from Emmanuel during his lifetime beyond ordinary birthday gifts, documentation of my professional credentials and employment history, any written communication between Emmanuel and me that demonstrated the natural and mutual character of our relationship, character references from people outside the family who had observed my interactions with my grandfather, and any evidence that contradicted the claim of diminished capacity, which would likely require medical records and testimony from Emmanuel's physicians. I spent that evening going through everything I had, and I want to be honest about something. There was a moment, sitting at that table with my notes spread in front of me and my dinner untouched beside me, where I felt the full weight of what they were doing. Not just the legal mechanics of it, the human weight of it. They were standing in front of a court and telling a story in which I had spent 11 years cultivating a relationship with my grandfather for financial gain. They were taking the truest thing in my adult life, those Sunday afternoons in Macon, the tea he poured before himself, the questions he asked that nobody else thought to ask, and they were reframing it as manipulation. I sat with that feeling long enough to understand it fully. Then I put it to one side and started working. I was not without resources. The professional life my family had never asked about turned out to be exactly the right preparation for what came next. I knew how to build a document record. I knew how to present information in a sequence that was clear, specific, and impossible to dismiss without engaging with each piece individually. I knew the difference between evidence that creates an impression and evidence that establishes a fact. I built the latter. Patricia Owusu was precise and thorough, and she did not waste motion. Over the following 6 weeks, she assembled a file that addressed every element of the petition directly. Emmanuel's physician of 14 years provided a written statement confirming that Emmanuel had been assessed as fully cognitively capable at the time the final will was executed, and had shown no signs of diminished capacity at any point in the 2 years prior to his death. The statement was detailed and clinical and contained no language that could be softened or reinterpreted. Mr. Hargrove provided his own affidavit. He stated that Emmanuel had come to him 4 times over the final decade to discuss and revise his estate planning, that each visit had been conducted without any family member present, that Emmanuel had on each occasion demonstrated clear and independent reasoning about his decisions, and that the final revision had been initiated entirely by Emmanuel without external prompting. He stated further that Emmanuel had specifically asked him about the legal mechanisms available to protect the final disposition from challenge, and that the protective forfeiture clause had been Emmanuel's own idea, suggested after Emmanuel had described to him a pattern of behavior he had observed in certain family members over many years. I read that affidavit 3 times. The last line of it stayed with me for a long time. My own professional records established clearly that I had never received financial transfers from Emmanuel beyond 2 birthday checks in amounts so ordinary they required no explanation. My employment history documented a career built entirely on independent work, with no connection to my grandfather's business holdings or network. I had never asked him for a referral. I had never asked him to use his name on my behalf. I had never asked him for anything that could be described as financial benefit. The character references came from colleagues, from a former supervisor at the federal contract position, from Mr. Del Rey, the county extension agent who had known Emmanuel through community work and had also met me twice at my grandfather's home over the years. Each reference was specific. None of them were performative. Then Patricia told me about one additional element that Mr. Hargrove had provided. Emmanuel had left a sealed letter with the firm, to be opened only in the event of a legal challenge to the will. Mr. Hargrove had been holding it since Emmanuel's death. The hearing would be the appropriate moment to enter it into the record. I did not know what the letter said. Patricia told me she had read it in Mr. Hargrove's presence to assess its relevance, and that it was relevant. She said nothing else about the contents. She said I would hear it at the same time as everyone else, which my grandfather had apparently intended deliberately. The hearing took place on a Wednesday morning at the Bibb County Courthouse in Macon. The room was smaller than I had expected, a civil hearing room with wood paneling and fluorescent lighting, and 2 long tables facing the judge's bench. Bernard and Victor and Darius sat at one table with their attorney, a man named Caldwell, who projected confidence with the particular ease of someone who has won enough cases to stop worrying about the ones he hasn't. Patricia and I sat at the other table. My mother sat in the gallery behind me. She had insisted on coming, and I had not argued with her. Judge Miriam Osei presided. She was a woman in her early 60s, with reading glasses, and a manner that reminded me of my grandfather's attorney in its deliberate unhurriedness. She looked at the petition, looked at our response filing, and opened the session without preamble. Caldwell presented the petition's case first. He described a pattern of isolation, a granddaughter who inserted herself into an elderly man's life with increasing frequency in his final years, while other family members were discouraged from close contact. He described Emmanuel's age and the natural vulnerabilities that accompany aging. He used the phrase undue familiarity twice. He spoke about the disproportion of the bequest relative to other family members and suggested that disproportion alone warranted scrutiny. He was polished. He was also working with nothing underneath the polish. Patricia presented our response methodically and without theater. The physician's statement, Mr. Hargrove's affidavit, the financial records, the professional history, The character references. She laid each piece in front of the judge and addressed each element of the petition directly and specifically. She did not editorialize. She did not make emotional arguments. She let the documentation carry the weight, which is what documentation is for when it has been built properly. When she finished, Judge Osei looked at the material for a long moment. Then she looked at Caldwell and asked him to address specifically the medical testimony regarding capacity. He attempted to. His response was general, where the physician statement had been specific, and the gap between the two was visible enough that Judge Osei noted it without expression. Then Mr. Hargrove was called to confirm his affidavit. He did so in the same unhurried manner he had brought to the will reading, each statement clear and unambiguous. When Caldwell attempted a cross-examination, Mr. Hargrove answered each question with the same precision he had used in the affidavit, adding nothing, conceding nothing, because there was nothing to concede. Then Patricia entered the sealed letter into the record. Judge Osei opened it herself. She read it without expression for approximately 2 minutes. Then she read one passage aloud into the record. My grandfather had written, in the careful and slightly formal English he used when he wanted to be precise, that he was aware his decision would not be received without resistance by certain members of his family. He had written that the resistance itself would serve as confirmation of the decision's correctness. He had written that Serena had never once, in 36 years, asked him for anything except his time. He had written that he had spent his life building things that outlasted him, and that he trusted her to understand both the weight and the purpose of what he was leaving behind. He had written that if this letter was being read in a courtroom, he was sorry only that he had not found a way to prevent the family from putting her through it. The room was very quiet when Judge Osei finished reading. Bernard was looking at the table in front of him. Victor's professional mask had developed a fracture along the jaw that he was working to control. Darius had his hands flat on the table and was looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone recalculating something they had been certain about. Judge Osei set the letter down. She looked at both tables. Then she said that the petition presented no credible evidence of either undue influence or diminished capacity, and that the documentation entered by the respondent was thorough, specific, and consistent across all sources. She said the will would stand in its entirety. She said the court noted the existence of the forfeiture clause, and that the petitioners and their counsel should be aware of its terms. She said the matter was closed. She did not editorialize further. She did not need to. I looked straight ahead when the gavel came down. I did not look at Bernard or Victor or Darius. I gathered my folder from the table, and I stood up and I thanked Patricia quietly. My mother's hand found my shoulder from the row behind me. In the hallway outside the hearing room, Caldwell spoke briefly to his clients and then left efficiently, the way attorneys leave when a case has gone in a direction they had perhaps privately anticipated. Bernard stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the floor. Victor was already on his phone. Darius sat on a hallway bench with his forearms on his knees. I walked past all of them toward the elevator. I did not stop. I did not look back. There was nothing left to say in that hallway that the hearing room had not already said more clearly than I could have said it. The elevator doors closed. My mother exhaled beside me. She said, "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing." I said, "Yes, he always did." The fallout did not arrive all at once. It came in the way that consequences usually come, when they are attached to people who have spent years believing they were exempt from them. Gradually, then in a way that was impossible to ignore. Bernard called me 4 days after the hearing, not to apologize, to explain. There is a difference, and I have learned over the years to notice it immediately. An apology begins with acknowledgement. An explanation begins with context, which is another word for justification dressed in softer clothing. His call began with context. He said the family had been under significant stress since Emmanuel's passing. He said grief made people act in ways they would not otherwise act. He said Darius had been particularly affected, and that Victor had perhaps moved too quickly without fully thinking through the implications. He said he hoped I understood that none of it had been personal. I listened to the entire call without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "I understand that you're explaining what happened." Then I told him that the legal process had concluded and that I wished him well. I did not tell him I forgave him, because I did not think that was what the moment required, and I have never found it useful to say things I do not mean to people who have given me sufficient evidence of how they operate. He waited for something more. I did not provide it. The call ended shortly after. Victor did not call. He sent an email 3 days after Bernard's call. It was 3 paragraphs long and written in the careful, measured language of a man who had decided that whatever had happened was a misunderstanding rather than a choice. He said the petition had been filed out of genuine concern and not out of any intent to cause harm. He said he respected the court's decision and hoped that professional relationships within the family could be preserved going forward. He signed it with his full name and his title, which I noticed, and which told me everything I needed to know about the email's actual purpose. It was less an apology than a record, something he could point to later if anyone asked whether he had tried to repair things. I read it once. I did not reply. Darius was the unexpected one. He did not call, and he did not send a formal email. He sent a text message on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after the hearing. It arrived at 8:14 at night, which I mention because the timing suggested he had been thinking about it for a while before sending it. The message was short. It said, "I don't expect you to respond to this. I just needed to say that what we did was wrong, and I knew it was wrong while we were doing it. I'm sorry, Serena. I know that doesn't fix anything." I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the table and sat with it for a while. There was something in those 2 sentences that felt different from Bernard's call and Victor's email. Not performed, not structured, just a person saying a thing they probably should have said earlier and saying it without expecting anything in return. I did not respond that evening, but I did not delete the message either. The broader consequences moved through the family's social world in the way these things do in communities where reputation is currency and news travels through the spaces between stated facts. The petition had been a matter of public record. The hearing had been attended by more than just our immediate family, court staff, other attorneys, a clerk who had grown up in Macon and knew the Adeyemi name. Within 2 weeks, enough people in the right circles understood what had happened that Bernard began experiencing the particular social friction that comes from being known to have done something that cannot quite be defended publicly. His property management company, which had operated for years on the credibility of the Adeyemi name, began losing that reflected warmth. 2 clients who had been with him for years did not renew contracts. A business partner he had been in discussions with for several months went quiet after the hearing in a way that Bernard attributed publicly to market conditions, and that everyone else understood differently. He did not lose everything, but he lost enough to feel it, which is how consequences work when they are real rather than theatrical. Victor's professional reputation was more insulated by distance and by the formal structures of his practice, but even there, the hearing had produced a document trail that existed permanently in the public record. Attorneys in overlapping circles had seen the filing. The word had moved. Nothing overt, nothing he could point to and dispute, just a new quality of carefulness in certain rooms that had not been there before. I did not engineer any of this. I want to say that clearly. I made no calls. I told no stories. I did not manage the narrative in any direction. I simply stopped protecting people from the consequences of what they had already done, which is different from revenge in a way that matters to me. My mother processed everything slowly and in her own way. She had believed, until the evidence became impossible to ignore, that the family was capable of a decency it had simply chosen not to display in this particular situation. Watching that belief adjust was something I witnessed with care and without comment, because it was her grief to work through and not mine to narrate. She called me more often in the months after the hearing, not to discuss what had happened, but just to talk about small things, about her plans now that she no longer needed to work, about the property in Macon that Emmanuel had left her, and what she wanted to do with the garden. Those calls mattered to me more than I knew how to say to her directly, so I answered them every time. The estate administration was methodical and demanding in the way that large administrative tasks are demanding when they are done properly. Patricia Owusu guided the process with the same precision she had brought to the hearing. Property titles transferred, accounts were consolidated and restructured. A management company was retained for the commercial properties, selected through a competitive process with no family connections involved. I reviewed every decision myself before it was finalized, which took time, but which also meant I understood what I was building rather than simply owning it. I kept my apartment in Decatur for several months after the will was settled. I was not in a hurry to make visible changes to my life, partly because I am not someone who moves quickly toward display, and partly because I needed time to understand what the estate actually meant before I started making decisions about it. Money at scale is not the same thing as money at a manageable level. The obligations are different. The decisions carry different weight. I had spent my career studying how money moves through organizations and what happens when the people responsible for it do not understand it deeply enough. I was not going to make that mistake with something my grandfather had spent 50 years building. 6 months after the hearing, I made one significant personal decision. I bought a house in Macon, not a large or conspicuous one. A house in a quiet neighborhood about 1.5 miles from Emmanuel's house, which I had also retained as part of the estate. The house I bought had a kitchen with good light in the mornings, and a back garden that needed work, and a front porch with 2 wooden chairs that the previous owners had left behind. I drove down on a Saturday in October to see it empty for the first time before the furniture arrived. I walked through each room slowly. I stood in the kitchen for a while with the morning light coming through the window. Then I went out to the front porch and sat in one of the 2 wooden chairs and looked at the quiet street and the trees that were beginning to change color, and I thought about my grandfather. I thought about all the first Sundays, the way his kitchen smelled, the tea he poured before himself, the questions he asked that nobody else thought to ask. The last time I had seen him, 6 weeks before he died, when he had held my hand at the door as I was leaving and said, "You know what I am most proud of?" And I had said, "What?" And he had said, "That you became exactly who you were going to be without asking anyone's permission." I had not understood entirely what he meant at the time. I thought I did. But sitting on that porch in October, with the estate settled and the hearing concluded, and the family at whatever distance they had arrived at, I understood it more completely. He had not left me money, not primarily. He had left me confirmation. Confirmation of something I had spent years knowing quietly and without external support, that the life I had built on my own terms, the work I had done without announcing it, the relationships I had tended without performing them, had been real and had been enough and had been seen by at least one person who mattered. The money was the visible part, the part that the family understood, the part that required courts and documents and attorneys to protect. But the actual inheritance was the letter he had left in Mr. Hargrove's office, the one that said she never once asked me for anything except my time. That was what he had given me, not just the estate, the record of being known. I sat on that porch until the light changed. Then I went inside and made tea in my own kitchen, in my own house, and drank it slowly, without rushing. About a month after I moved to Macon, I received a text from Darius. He said he was going to be in the area and asked if I would be willing to meet for coffee. Nothing more than that, just coffee, and that he would understand if I said no. I sat with the message for 2 days. Then I replied and said I would meet him for 30 minutes at a place near the town center on a Thursday morning. He arrived before me and was already seated when I walked in. He looked different from the courthouse version of himself, less assembled. He stood when I came in, which I had not expected, and said, "Thank you for coming," before I had even sat down. We talked for 40 minutes, which was 10 minutes longer than I had allocated. He did not ask for anything. He did not attempt to reframe what had happened. He said he had spent the months since the hearing thinking about the kind of person he had been in that family and whether that person was who he wanted to continue being. He said watching the hearing had been the first time he had seen clearly how the family actually operated, as though seeing it aimed at someone else made it visible in a way it never had been when it was aimed at him. I listened. I did not offer more warmth than I actually felt, which was not much yet, but I did not close the door either. I told him that trust was something that moved slowly in one direction at a time, and that I was not in a position to offer him anything beyond this conversation right now. He said that was fair. He said he wasn't asking for more than that. We finished our coffee. He paid for both without asking. We walked out to the street, and he said he hoped things were going well in Macon. I told him they were beginning to be. Then we went in different directions, and I walked back to my car and drove home. I did not know if that was the beginning of something repaired or simply a conversation that stood on its own. I did not need to know yet. Some things resolve on a timeline that is longer than the moment you are standing in, and I had learned to be patient with that. What I knew was simpler and more durable than any of those open questions. I knew that I was in a house that was mine, that the work I had spent years doing quietly had turned out to matter, that my grandfather had seen me clearly and had found a way to say so in a document that a judge had read aloud in a room full of people who had never bothered to look. That the family's attempt to reduce what he had decided had failed not because I had fought loudly, but because the truth had been built too carefully over too many years to be dismantled by people who had only ever paid attention to the surface of things. I knew that the version of me who sat at that dinner table being called difficult, whose work was called safe but unglamorous, whose monthly visits to Macon were described as insertion rather than devotion, that version of me had been real. She had been hurt by real things, and she had kept going anyway, not to prove anything, but because the work was worth doing and the relationship was worth tending, and some things deserve your commitment regardless of whether anyone else recognizes them. I thought about that sometimes in the evenings on the front porch, the 2 wooden chairs, the street going quiet, the garden in the back that I was slowly learning to manage, one season at a time. My grandfather had once told me that the only wealth worth building was the kind that could not be taken from you when the paperwork changed hands. I had assumed he meant character. I think now he meant both. I was learning to hold them together, the paperwork and the character, the estate and the person it had been left to, the inheritance and the life I was still in the process of building around it, one careful day at a time.